Maybe we now realize the way racial bias can infect us even when we don't realize it. So that we're guarding against not just racial slurs, but we're also guarding against this subtle impulse to call Johnny back for a job interview, but not Jamal.
That was US President Barack Obama speaking at the Mass for Pastor Clementa Pinckney, one of the 9 people, of course, killed by a white shooter at a historic black church in South Carolina last year. Welcome back. We're talking about race relations in the United States. Thanks so much for the panel joining us again. I just want to pick up with you, Julianne, because we ended with Barbara in the previous segment. A lot has happened in the second term, too, and we've seen a lot of allegations of police violence, black men unarmed, gunned down in the streets. We saw what happened in Ferguson, the Black Lives Matter movement. This is quite incredible that this is happening to an outsider, perhaps, under an African-American president.
The fact that this president is African-American has nothing to do with structural racism. The fact that we have an African-American president does not mean someone has sprinkled magic dust around this country and people have let go of their racial ideas. In fact, I think that because we have an African-American president, what we've had is a major racial backlash. We've seen the N-word used a lot more, very casually. You've seen people talk openly about, you know, being racist. You've seen the Trump rhetoric, which has not been as pointedly directed to African-Americans as others, but has been very pointedly directed. And so I think that many feel, even as President Obama was elected, you heard people celebrating, now we can be post-racial. Well, how can you be post-racial?
There was a lot of white people saying that, I presume.
Yeah, but how can you be post-racial when the black unemployment rate is twice the white rate? I'll be post-racial when I have the same kind of data that actually whites are experiencing. And so we've seen a horrid backlash, and that backlash has empowered people to say some of the kinds of things that they wouldn't say, 10 years ago.
And you said the magic words, structural racism. It's fascinating to me that the first time this president uttered that term, and he actually said systemic racism, was at that Mass. And then the same year at the NAACP convention. What if he had talked about that his entire term? 2 terms. What a difference it would have made for Americans to understand that structural racism is the enemy and that demographic change is good. If he had just said that,
I think one of us is going to have to at least say this, and that is clearly the Obama administration was thinking ahead to the second term.
Right.
There's no ifs, ands, buts about it. He knew how he got elected. He got elected by saying we're not a blue nation, we're not a red nation,
we are the
United Nation, a united people, and that appealed to a lot of individuals. But what white America has got to stop doing is every time somebody says Black Lives Matter, then they go, well, all lives matter. Well, of course, all lives matter, but you do not use that as a way to somehow suggest that if I focus on my life, I'm not diminishing your life.
But
sorry, Julianne, just one thing, because we are talking about US President Barack Obama, and I do want to play some words before we run out of time. And this was his reaction to the killing of Trayvon Martin, of course, who was shot by George Zimmerman. Let's have a look at this, because I want to ask you why he said this and didn't necessarily say things earlier in his term. Let's play it.
When Trayvon Martin was first shot, I said that this could have been my son. Another way of saying that is Trayvon Martin could have been me 35 years ago. There are very few African-American men in this country who haven't had the experience of being followed when they were shopping in a department store. That includes me. There are very, very few African-American men who haven't had the experience of walking across the street and hearing the locks click on the doors of cars. That happens to me, at least before I was a senator. There are very few African Americans who haven't had the experience of getting on an elevator and a woman clutching her purse nervously and holding her breath until she had a chance to get off.
Julianne, do you see those as really strong words that perhaps he could have used earlier in his term about all other elements of race?
They should have been used earlier. When he had the beer summit, I write about a bit in the book, when Henry Louis Gates, someone broke...
That's right, the professor at Harvard.
Yeah, they
That's
arrested
right.
him for breaking into his own house, and it devolved. And then the president said something I thought was perfectly right. Every black man has had this experience. And then the police sort of hollered, and so he has this beer summit where the professor gets to sit with the policeman who arrested him. I mean, I think that requires enormous forbearance. And my response was, invite Pookie to a beer summit. You know, invite somebody who really has something to say to one of these beer summits. I want to very quickly circle back around to the Black Lives Matter, only to say this. Black lives are the only lives that have been constitutionally devalued. We were constitutionally 3/5 of a person. So it does make sense to assert that Black lives matter, that we are equal. This is something that our society does not claim. And this president, in trying to have it both ways, I mean, in his 2008 speech, which you mentioned, he talked about immigration and all of it. He basically made slavery and immigration the same thing, which they aren't. He keeps trying to have it both ways. He could have been such a transformative leader. Instead, what he's been is an adequate center-left president. I don't think we would have gotten much different had we Hillary Clinton in 2008.
Well, I actually think that probably some of the best work that he's done, and it has been second term.
Is that because he didn't have to face re-election?
Right.
I mean, every president runs to
it
get re-elected.
Barbara, it's been this last year.
It has been.
It's been this last year, not the whole term.
And it's been Black Lives Matters when he absolutely, you know, stood up and had the summit and had the meeting with the Black Lives Matter activists and leaders. I think that was a good move.
Yes.
I think his taking on criminal justice reform and saying that mass incarceration needs to be stopped and pushing for that. I wish, of course, they were a lot stronger. I don't like the bill that's in front of Congress right now. It's a bad bill.
He's had to do a deal with Republicans.
It's a bad bill. And it's not going to accomplish what's needed. And putting Loretta Lynch.
Yeah,
yes.
and the
finally a black woman on the cabinet.
And I hope that they would think about a black woman for Supreme Court justice.
Absolutely.
But I would also say this. Let me add this, because I empathize very much with the president on this. I can walk out of here now dressed like I'm dressed with my background and resume, and I can't get a cab in Washington, D.C. And let me tell you something. This is what we need to understand. This is cultural. And I've said this all my life. In America, and globally, quite honestly, we are culturally conditioned to believe that white is superior and black is inferior. And the manifestation of that cultural conditioning is that black people are undervalued, underestimated, and marginalized. And until that is reversed, we are always going to have this issue of race.
And underpaid. And undervalued, but we also have to talk about underpaid because of the whole issues of access. A series of issues germinate from the fact that we have this pay issue. We have things like access to education, but also things like dental care. Things that make a serious difference in qualities of life. 25% of young African Americans have never seen a dentist, even though they have 25%. And it's 29.6% to be exact. But just go down and look at some of these things. And so, you know, someone might listen to the president talking about not getting a cab or listening to Joe talk about it and say, that's no big thing.
Yes,
but it's a huge thing
yeah.
because that's not getting a cab, it's everything.
These are quality of life things that mean something bigger, right?
Yes.
Right, and also there are economic consequences, right? If you can't get a cab when you need one, I mean, I've had instances where I've been late to things because no cab would stop and get me. So these are real. And I also think that, you know, that when we look at this president's record, that we got to remember that because we live in a society based on white structural racism, that when white people hear Black Lives Matters, they hear it as an anti-white message. And that's why they respond. And that's because...
But whenever they hear the word white...
But that's because white supremacy has always been tied to the word white. And they don't understand that when blacks use blacks, they're not tying it to black supremacy.
White, look,
so you
white
think
is
different answer has really helped actually push the president further than he wanted to go?
It's pushed the president, it's pushed both the Democratic candidates.
Yes.
I think that it has ossified the racism on the part of some of the Republican candidates, and you can hear their resistance to it. I think that these young people are absolutely brilliant.
I love them.
They are the inheritors of the dream, and they're going about it in very, very appropriate ways. It's just extremely important to watch them do their work.
They are the SNCC of the 21st century.
yes.
That's what they are.
I'm old enough to remember that. A lot of our audience isn't. That's a subject for another programme. Julianne Malveaux, Joe Madison, Barbara Arnwine, thank you so much for joining us. As we end this programme, perhaps it is only fitting that we set aside policy and politics. It's, if only for a moment, to reflect on a truly human experience. 106-year-old Virginia McLaurin waited all her life to see an African-American in the White House. Her reaction might just say it all.
How are you?
I'm fine.
Oh, it's so nice to see you.
It's an honor.
You want to say hi to Michelle?
Yes!
Slow down, man. She's 106.
No, you are not. You are not.
You slow down.
Oh my goodness. I thought I would never live to get in the White House.
Well, you are right here.
And I tell you, I am so happy. We are happy to have you. Like President. Look at him. Hey! Right there. Like, that's me. Yes.